My name is Tessa Griffin, and the name of my presentation is Malice Murder or Wrongful Conviction. The objectives of my presentation: I will give a brief overview of the victim as well as the defendant. I will provide a synopsis of the crime. I will list evidence that are relevant to the prosecution as well as evidence relevant to the defense. I'll explain events of the first trial and what led to a retrial, and I will list evidence and how it will affect the new trial. The victim was Belinda Timble. She was a special education teacher at Katy High School in Katy, Texas. She was the mother of one son by the name of Ethan Temple, who was 3 years old at the time, and she was also 8 months pregnant with her second child at the time of her death. David Temple, he was a former football coach in Katy, Texas as well. He was the husband of Belinda, and he was also the defendant accused of her murder. On January the 11th of 1999, Belinda was found murdered in the closet of her bedroom. She was shot execution style in the back of her head with a 12-gauge shotgun at close range. There were no weapons or shell casings found on the scene, nor was there any blood splatter or other matter transfer found, which indicated that her murderer had an opportunity to clean or clear the area of any evidence. Downstairs of the home was in disarray. It was made to look like a home invasion. There was a television that had been taken off of the stand. It was seated on the floor, but the television was still plugged into the wall. There were drawers that had been opened, but there was nothing to indicate that anyone had fumbled through those drawers. There were no valuable items that were seen to have been taken, and there was a broken glass in the back door, which meant that that was made to look as if it was a possible entry. The evidence that the prosecution provided, a crime scene investigator testified that the scene looked like it was staged to look like a home invasion. They stated that the broken glass was not consistent to any forced entry at the back door. They also mentioned that the drawers did not look like they had been rummaged through, and they claimed that the husband was emotionally abusive, and he was also having an affair at that time with a fellow teacher by the name of Heather Scott, whom he married 2 years later. The defense presented that Belinda had an altercation with one of her students, and he was angry at her, and he could have possibly been the killer. They also stated that there was a time deficit, seeing that David Temple and his son was captured on surveillance video at a grocery store shortly after the murder. So the time deficit basically states that meant that he did not have an opportunity or the time to get back to his home, murder his wife, and clean up behind himself before the arrival of the police. During the first criminal trial, it lasted all of 10 weeks, and after all of the evidence that were presented by both the prosecution and the defense, Temple was finally convicted of murdering his wife and his unborn son in November of 2007. He was sentenced to life in prison, parole only after 30 years. And of course, he appealed that conviction. He spent 9 years in prison waiting on the results of the appeal. The conviction was overturned due to some prosecutorial misconduct. Basically, it was stated that the Brady rule had been violated, and David Temple did not receive a fair trial. There were 30 instances of misconduct. So the court concluded that that the previous conviction was overturned. This occurred in November of 2016, and by December of 2016, Temple was out on a $30,000 bond awaiting his retrial. Now, the exculpatory evidence. There were other persons of interest. Riley Sanders, who happened to be 16 years old at that time, he was one of their neighbors. Earlier, before Belinda's murder, he had skipped school while his parents were out of town. Him and his friends were at his parents' home, and Belinda had found some evidence of some beer bottles and other paraphernalia in her yard and had confronted Riley about those things. And he knew that had that information got back to his parents, that of course he would be in trouble. So it was also stated that 4 days before Belinda's murder, he had taken his father's 12-gauge shotgun. That once that shotgun was retrieved, it had been fired, and he had also skipped school on the day of Belinda's murder. He failed several polygraphs, but this information was not given to the defense attorneys until halfway through the first trial. A new witness that will go into the new trial is a Daniel Glasscock, who was actually friends with Riley Sanders at the time of Belinda's murder. He stated earlier that he had overheard a conversation between Riley and some other friends, and they were speaking on things that had been mentioned in Belinda's murder. Now, will this be a trial of premeditated murder, malice murder, or voluntary manslaughter? Will the unborn victims of violent acts be a factor in this matter, seeing as to a fetus was murdered as well? These are all out. Will all be entered into evidence in the second trial. The second trial, which actually began on July the 8th of 2019, which was a few days ago. Testimony continues throughout this week. Circumstantial evidence will be entered, as well as the hard evidence that were withheld from the defense attorneys in the first term. So, after this trial ends, will David Temple be a free man, or will other evidence come out that he was actually the murderer of his child? The fellow teacher, Heather Scott Temple, actually filed for divorce 3 days after the trial began. 2 days after the trial began, which was actually Thursday of this week. And she will actually be a witness for the prosecution. So, at this particular moment, it's hard to say which direction this trial will take. But was a guilty man, had a guilty man been rightfully accused, or was an innocent man in prison for 9 years of his life? We'll find out at the end of this trial, which could possibly last up to 2 weeks.